27 million American voters, mostly Black and Latino, have just been deprived of the right to vote just because of the color of their skin. Judge Neil Gorsuch, a white male Supreme Court justice, looked down from the bench with that familiar cold stare. And when Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, a Black woman from Texas, began to speak, he cut her off mid-sentence. "This court is not for people like you to speak," he snapped, loud enough for the courtroom to hear. Some in the gallery chuckled, others looked away, embarrassed for her. The message was clear. "Sit down, girl. You don't belong here." But Jasmine didn't sit. She didn't flinch, and she refused to back down. Instead, she looked him straight in the eye, and with one sentence, just one, she turned the room upside down. This wasn't just a courtroom debate. It was a face-off between power and conscience, between robes and reality, between a white male justice and a Black woman refusing to be silenced. And to better understand this story, we have to go back to where it all began. Long before Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett ever stood in the Supreme Court, before she ever held a microphone on Capitol Hill or locked eyes with a judge who wanted her silent, she was just a girl from South Dallas. Her world wasn't filled with marble columns or leather-bound law books. It was the smell of brisket smoking in the backyard, the hum of an old fan spinning on a porch where her grandmother shelled peas, and the Sunday clack of patent leather shoes on a church floor. Her mama was a night shift nurse who always smelled faintly of antiseptic and lavender, and her daddy fixed transmissions in a shop where the air was thick with grease and gospel. Jasmine's first courtroom wasn't one she walked into. It was one she watched on a grainy television, curled up next to her father during reruns of Matlock, asking every 2 minutes, "Wait, but why is the lawyer allowed to talk like that?" From the time she could form a full sentence, Jasmine asked questions that made adults pause. At age 9, she corrected her civics teacher in front of the entire class after the woman casually said that Congress makes the rules, the court just follows. Jasmine shot her hand up and said, "Actually, courts interpret the law, and sometimes they strike down the rules Congress makes." The class laughed. The teacher didn't. 10 minutes later, Jasmine was in the principal's office with a referral slip for disruption and a smirk that said she'd do it again. By 13, she had developed a reputation at her small church, not just for her braids and Sunday dresses, but for her mouth. One morning during youth sermon, the pastor called out, "We should all be quiet and wait on God's answers." Without missing a beat, Jasmine stood up and replied, "Reverend, respectfully, I think God's waiting on us." The room froze. Her mother covered her mouth in horror, but someone in the back let out a loud, proud laugh. It was Sister Barnes, the oldest woman in the congregation, who muttered, "Well, she ain't wrong." That was Jasmine, smart, bold, unapologetic. But what made her dangerous wasn't her volume. It was her clarity. Even as a teenager, she didn't speak just to be heard. She spoke because she believed silence was a choice, and often a dangerous one. And yet, no matter how many times adults told her to hush, to learn her place, or to wait her turn, Jasmine seemed to know something that others didn't, that being quiet wouldn't protect her, and being respectful didn't always mean being silent. Years later, Jasmine found herself standing in a real courtroom, not as a witness, not as a student, but as a public defender. It was her first trial. Her client was a 22-year-old Black man accused of stealing a car. The prosecution's entire case relied on the fact that the man had been seen near the vehicle the night it was taken. No fingerprints, no surveillance, just proximity and prejudice. Jasmine had worked the case for weeks, sleeping in her car some nights, interviewing bus drivers, digging through cell tower records no one else cared about. She came to court that day with a manila folder full of receipts and a fire in her chest. And then the judge walked in, a middle-aged white man with silver hair, a navy tie, and a tone that carried condescension like it was stitched into his robe. He barely glanced at her, barely said her name. But the moment she raised her voice in opening arguments to challenge the prosecution's timeline, he interrupted her. "Miss Crockett," he said flatly, "this courtroom needs less fire, more facts." The room fell quiet. Jasmine blinked once. Then she reached into her folder and began laying out every fact she had, one by one, backed by timestamp, location, and witness. She didn't shout, she didn't apologize, but she didn't shrink either. Her voice was steady, her logic airtight. When the jury returned the verdict hours later, not guilty, even the bailiff looked surprised. After court, as she gathered her files, that same judge approached her. He looked like he wanted to say something, but didn't. Instead, he gave a small nod, turned, and walked away. Jasmine didn't smile. She didn't need to. She had done what they told her not to. She brought fire and facts, and she won. The narrator's voice fades in. That was the first time Jasmine Crockett was told to lower her voice. It wouldn't be the last. But from that moment forward, she understood something most people don't. When your truth makes powerful people uncomfortable, you're probably saying something that matters. The double doors of the Supreme Court opened slowly, as if time itself had to yield to the weight of tradition inside. Jasmine Crockett stepped through them, her heels clicking against polished marble that seemed to echo louder than usual. She wore a deep navy suit, sharp line, no frills, and deliberate. It wasn't there to impress, it was there to declare. But the moment she crossed the threshold, the whispers began. Is she with someone? She's not from the DOJ, is she? Maybe staff for one of the justices? The assumptions wrapped around her like a fog, thick, quiet, and loaded with centuries of expectation. Her walk was steady, her breath controlled. But then, as if on cue, she caught her heel on the edge of a burgundy carpet seam and stumbled slightly. It wasn't a fall, just a minor misstep. But in a room like this, even gravity felt like it was watching. Under her breath, she muttered, "Great start, Jazz," and straightened up without missing a beat. A few reporters in the gallery chuckled. One security guard, clearly unsure of who she was, approached her and gently offered a visitor badge. Jasmine looked down at it, then up at him. "I'm not visiting," she said calmly. "I'm presenting." The guard's eyes widened, and he quietly stepped aside. As she made her way to the counsel table, Jasmine could feel it, the invisible stare of a room unsure what to make of her. She wasn't old enough. She wasn't light enough. She wasn't silent enough. And yet, here she was, representing not just a congressional seat in Texas, but millions of Americans whose voices had been conveniently cut from the conversation. She took her seat, adjusted the stack of notes she had already memorized, and waited. She didn't come to ask for permission. She came to deliver a message. When the justices entered, the room transformed. What had been whispers and side eyes turned into cold formality, like a thunderstorm snapping everything into place. 9 figures in black robes appeared behind the bench, eyes heavy with the weight of legacy. They didn't smile. They didn't scan the room. They simply took their seats, stone-faced and unreadable. Jasmine looked up and saw them clearly for the first time. Not as photos in textbooks or quotes on news scrolls, but as people. People who would decide whether democracy bent or held. But as she studied them, none of them looked back. Not directly. Not fully. It was as if she was expected to exist only in her outline, not her presence. The narrator's voice returned, low and heavy. It wasn't a welcome. It was a warning. And then Judge Neil Gorsuch shifted. His glance was brief, but filled with everything she already knew. Skepticism, dismissal, irritation. A man whose courtroom had long been guarded like a cathedral, now interrupted by a voice he didn't expect, and perhaps didn't believe belonged there. He leaned slightly to the side, whispered something to the justice next to him, then looked away. Jasmine didn't react. She simply rose, walked slowly to the podium, and adjusted the microphone. It squeaked slightly as she lowered it to her height, another small reminder of how this space wasn't built with her in mind. She placed both hands on the podium, steadied herself, and took one breath. The kind of breath someone takes before leaping off a cliff or standing up alone in a room designed to keep them quiet. Her voice rang out clearly, firmly, without apology. "Your Honors, I stand here today not as a politician, but as a daughter of democracy, And I speak on behalf of the millions who will never get to walk into this room, but who will live with the consequences of what happens inside it. And just like that, the temperature in the chamber changed. She had barely made it through her third sentence. Jasmine stood tall at the podium, speaking with clarity and calm force, laying the foundation for her constitutional argument. Her tone was measured, her cadence respectful but firm. The voice of someone who had spent her life translating injustice into action. But even before she could reach the central point of her opening, the interruption came. Loud, unmistakable, dismissive. Judge Neil Gorsuch leaned slightly forward, eyes cool and fixed, and spoke with a sharpness that cut through the chamber like a blade. "This court," he said, voice echoing off marble, "is not for people like you to speak." For a half second, the room froze in disbelief. Then came the uncomfortable shuffling, the tight throats, and the audible chuckles from a few corners of the gallery. Dry, awkward, half trying to stifle, half letting them out like steam from a pressure valve. Jasmine didn't blink, but something inside her shifted. She could feel it. The room had turned. The unspoken divide had become spoken. And though she kept her body still, her breath caught slightly in her chest. A few rows back, a black woman in a gray sweater clutched her purse tighter. Her lips parted in disbelief. Her eyes fixed on Jasmine like she was willing strength into her from the gallery. One young law clerk, maybe fresh out of Yale, looked down, unable to meet her gaze. A man in a pinstripe suit tried to hide a smirk. For the first time that morning, Jasmine was reminded she wasn't just here to argue a case. She was here to defend her right to even speak it. The silence that followed wasn't polite. It was cold, like the courtroom itself was waiting to see whether she would flinch, whether the voice that had traveled so far would suddenly break. Jasmine looked down for a second, not to retreat, but to gather. Her fingers lightly tapped the edge of the podium, once, twice. Then with deliberate calm, she lifted her head. Her eyes locked onto Gorsuch. And though her voice came quietly, it rang out with the weight of history behind it. "Then," she said, "I must be in exactly the right place." There was no music, no dramatic lighting, just pure electric stillness. For a moment you could hear the soft click of a recorder stopping. Every reporter's fingers froze above their keyboards, suspended in midair, like witnesses to a live fault line. The air itself felt like it inhaled. A second passed, then two. Even Justice Morales, who had barely moved all morning, looked up. Gorsuch didn't respond. He blinked once, leaned back in his chair, and said nothing. It was not victory, not yet. But it was the kind of moment that history remembers, the one where a voice expected to cower, instead climbed. The narrator's voice returns, slow and quiet. Power expected silence. It got a storm instead. Jasmine gripped the podium more firmly now. The courtroom was still cold, but she had shifted the current. She had survived the first strike, and now it was her turn to set the terms. Her voice softened, but the words didn't lose their edge. "Let me tell you about Miss Leona," she said. 86 years old, lives in Oak Cliff, voted in every election since 1964. She paused, letting the numbers settle. Walked 4 miles to her polling station last November because the elevator in her building was broken. Again, and the nearest accessible bus stop had been rerouted out of her neighborhood after the last redistricting. She scanned the bench. And when she got there, after all that, she was turned away because the state said her birth certificate was missing. The phrase lingered, quiet but sharp. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She was speaking of a reality some on that bench had never seen. One justice, a younger man with wireframe glasses and a clipped tone, began to lean forward as if preparing to interrupt. But Jasmine kept going. She told the poll worker, "I've been voting longer than you've been alive. Don't tell me I don't exist." A few snickers from the gallery, tense and awkward, tried to escape. Then Jasmine delivered the punchline. A line that, even in this marble temple of seriousness, drew out actual laughter. She later told me, "If they think I'm too old to vote, I'm old enough to haunt them." The courtroom cracked slightly, the way ice shifts under pressure. A clerk smirked. A law student buried her grin into her notebook. Even one of the older justices allowed the corner of his mouth to twitch, just briefly. But Jasmine's face stayed serious. The smile had been Miss Leona's. The weight was still hers. She served this country, paid her taxes, raised 3 generations. But when her vote became inconvenient to the system, she vanished from the records. She paused again, not for effect, but to remind the room. This wasn't theater. This was someone's life. That's when it came, sharp and clipped, the voice of Judge Gorsuch cutting through the moment like a wire snapping. Anecdotes are not law, he said, not looking at her, but at his notes. This court does not decide cases on emotion. His tone was colder than before, as if the laughter had offended the sanctity of the bench. The silence that followed was different now. Not disbelief, but the weight of returning to business as usual. The implication was clear. Sit back down. Leave your stories at the door. But Jasmine didn't flinch. She stepped slightly forward and replied with the same calm force that had begun to define her presence. Then let's talk about the law that broke her. She reached into her binder and pulled out a color-coded list. 73 counties in the last decade have redrawn district lines in ways that disproportionately fractured communities of color. The data isn't anecdotal, it's deliberate. She held the document high enough for the court to see. In one Texas district, a single black neighborhood was split across 3 separate voting zones, 3, making it mathematically impossible for their votes to matter. A murmur rippled through the gallery. One reporter's hand covered her mouth. Another typed furiously on his phone, already pushing the quote to Twitter. On the bench, Gorsuch sat back in his chair. He didn't speak again. He didn't need to. Jasmine had already shifted the balance of the room. Her voice was no longer just part of an argument. It was the argument. The narrator's voice returned softly with weight. In a room made for law, she made the law human again. Judge Neil Gorsuch shifted forward in his chair, his robe rustling like a storm gathering behind the bench. His eyes narrowed, sharp and unblinking, as if trying to dissect her confidence down to its smallest parts. His tone changed, no longer distant or dismissive, but challenging. Congresswoman Crockett, he began, with a trace of calculated coolness. This court is not a campaign stage. If your aim is to stir sentiment or score political points, I suggest you reconsider your purpose here. The words landed hard, not because they were loud, but because they were precise, the kind of legal slap meant to paint her as emotional, theatrical, out of place. But Jasmine didn't blink. Instead, a small smile played at the corner of her mouth, not sarcastic, not smug, just calm, centered, and devastating in its quiet confidence. She looked up at him, straight into the storm, and said gently, I came with the Constitution, not a campaign. A few scattered coughs in the gallery tried to cover the reaction. One law professor whispered to the person next to him, That's going in textbooks. Gorsuch blinked once and sat back slowly. He hadn't lost control of the courtroom, but he had lost control of the rhythm. And Jasmine knew it. What he had framed as a performance, she had reframed as purpose. And purpose, she knew, was something the Constitution was meant to protect, not punish. As the moment settled, Jasmine leaned slightly forward, her voice now low but resonant, the kind of voice that makes people lean in, not because it's loud, but because it refuses to tremble. You speak of law, she said, as if it floats above people. But I'm here to remind you, it lands on their backs. For a split second, the chamber held its breath. The line wasn't dramatic in tone, but its truth struck like thunder. The air shifted. Reporters paused. Even the courtroom's typically stone-faced stenographer looked up from her machine. And then, something no one expected happened. Justice Barrow, the most conservative voice on the bench, known for his rigid textualism and sharp dissents, raised one eyebrow. Not in mockery, in surprise. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of weight. Jasmine's words weren't just elegant rhetoric. They were undeniable. They pulled the legal theory down from the ceiling and laid it bare in the dirt, where it crushes real people with real names, like Miss Leona and thousands like her. The other justices didn't speak. Even Gorsuch, for all his authority, didn't offer another retort. And in that stillness, Jasmine didn't gloat. She simply stood. For her district, for the 27 million Americans pushed to the political margins, for every person who had ever been told the law didn't belong to them. The narrator returned, voice steady and proud. They asked for case law. She gave them the case of America. The courtroom, once teeming with whispers and subtle gestures, had gone unnaturally still. No one shuffled papers. No pens tapped. Even the steady clack of the stenographer's machine seemed to hesitate. Jasmine stood unmoving behind the podium, her last words still lingering in the air, like the final chord of a hymn no one dared follow. She paused, not because she lost her place, not because she was unsure, but because she knew the silence now belonged to her. It was no longer cold or hostile, it was reverent. She slowly reached into her jacket pocket, her movements deliberate and precise, and pulled out a single folded paper. She didn't wave it or hold it up theatrically. She simply unfolded it with care, like one might smooth out a letter from a loved one. Holding it in both hands, she said, "This is the oath I took when I was sworn into Congress." Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The quiet made every word land like thunder. It reads, "I do solemnly swear that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic." Then she looked up, not at the gallery, not at the clerks, but straight at the bench. Her tone sharpened, not in anger, but in duty. "That same Constitution that gives you power gives me responsibility." It was not an accusation. It was a reminder, a moral alignment that stretched beyond legal theory and into civic truth. She wasn't arguing a case anymore. She was defending the soul of American democracy, and every eye in the chamber could feel it. For the first time that session, Judge Neil Gorsuch didn't lean back in defiance or interrupt with cold precision. He didn't purse his lips or scribble something dismissive into his notepad. He simply blinked, and then slowly lowered his eyes. It was subtle, no dramatics, no collapse of authority, but the shift was unmistakable. He wasn't surrendering. He was listening, truly listening. And that, in a courtroom this rigid, this protected by centuries of pomp and marble, was more shocking than anything Jasmine could have shouted. In the far back corner of the courtroom, a young white legal clerk, maybe 25, dressed in a stiff navy blazer, quietly lifted her hand to her face. She tried to hide it, but not fast enough. She was wiping a tear. One, quick, real. That's when the emotional dam broke. Not into chaos, not into noise, but into quiet reckoning. The narrator returned, voice low and resolute. She didn't shout. She didn't plead. She just reminded the court who it was supposed to serve. The courtroom returned to its usual formality as Jasmine stepped down from the podium, but the shift had already happened. Something invisible had cracked open. Not in the marble, but in the mood. It wasn't loud. It wasn't obvious. But it was real. And 29 minutes later, as Jasmine was still walking down the courthouse steps, clutching her notes and bracing for the press, her phone buzzed with the first notification. Then the second. Then 50. A clip, only 37 seconds long, had been posted by a legal blogger in the gallery. It showed Jasmine calmly raising the oath, looking Gorsuch in the eye and saying, "The same Constitution that gives you power gives me responsibility." By the time she reached the bottom step, the clip had passed 1 million views. On Twitter, hashtags like #CROCKETTCLASH and #CONSTITUTIONALQUEEN were trending. Someone tweeted, "She told the Supreme Court the truth, and they couldn't handle it." Another post read, "We just witnessed the moment history pivoted on a black woman's calm stare." But the internet didn't stop at commentary. That evening, a teenager in Atlanta, a high school sophomore named Jordan, uploaded an edited version of the clip set to a gospel choir soundtrack. The timing was perfect. Every pause, every stare, every line matched a rising crescendo of voices singing, "We shall not be moved." The caption read, "Jasmine Crockett just put robes on trial." Within 2 hours, the video had 200,000 likes. A Texas grandmother commented under the video, "My knees are bad, but if I could have stood in that room with her, I would have." Someone replied, "You did." She took us all in there. By the end of the week, Jasmine had received over 52,000 emails. They poured in from every state: truck drivers in Mississippi, retired teachers in Michigan, baristas in Boston, veterans in Arizona. Some messages were short. "Thank you for not backing down." Others were pages long. Stories of voter suppression, lost ballots, polling stations that disappeared overnight. People shared photos of their elders. One woman attached an image of her mother in a wheelchair, holding up a "Let Us Vote" sign outside a closed polling location. But one letter stood out. It was handwritten on crisp white paper from a man named Edward M. Clark, retired district judge from Alabama. A white man in his 70s, he had served for over 3 decades on the bench. His handwriting was careful, almost reverent. It read, "Congresswoman Crockett, I watched your argument with disbelief, then humility. I realized I've spent my entire legal life defending a system I never questioned enough. You were right. I was wrong. For decades. And I thank you for making me see it before I leave this earth." Jasmine read it twice, then placed it in a separate folder. She didn't cry, but she sat quietly for a while after that, her hand resting over the words as if steadying the weight of what they meant. The narrator returned, softer now. She walked into the court with arguments. She walked out with a movement. Weeks had passed since the day Jasmine Crockett stood before the 9 justices in the nation's highest court. The media cycle had spun, calmed, then reignited. Professors debated her impact on televised panels. High schoolers recited her lines for speech contests. The legal world moved on, or so it seemed. But somewhere inside the quiet inner sanctums of the Supreme Court, away from the cameras, the bloggers, and the trending hashtags, something else was shifting. One late evening, in the near-empty corridors of the court, a clerk, young, eager, and sworn to silence, overheard a quiet conversation. Judge Neil Gorsuch, normally guarded to the point of calculation, sat behind his chamber desk, speaking more to himself than to anyone else. He wasn't angry. He wasn't lecturing. He was thinking. And then, with a tone almost too soft to catch, he said, "That woman changed how I see things. That scares me more than I want to admit." The clerk didn't speak, but the words etched themselves into memory like a signature carved into glass. By the next week, they had found their way to a legal journalist, and from there, quietly leaked into the bloodstream of public conversation. The story didn't make the evening news. It didn't need to, because for those who understood power, that single sentence meant something profound. The man who had once told her, "This court is not for people like you to speak," had been forced, however quietly, to listen. Not long after the hearing, Jasmine agreed to a single one-on-one interview with a local station back home in Texas. No national network, no primetime spotlight, just a modest setup in a community center where folding chairs still creaked and the lights flickered when the coffee pot kicked on. The interviewer, a black woman named Trina, who had covered Jasmine back when she was still a public defender, kept the tone warm but honest. "Did you go into that courtroom expecting to win?" she asked. Jasmine paused, exhaled gently, then said, "I didn't go there to win. I went so the silence would stop." The room went still, and that sentence, simple, human, unforgettable, began its journey. Within days, it was painted across murals in voting rights centers. Teachers printed it in bold letters and taped it above whiteboards in classrooms. Coffee mugs, T-shirts, screen-printed tote bags, all bearing the same truth. The law should protect the people, not hide from them. And that was the moment it became more than a legal memory. It became a message. The narrator returns one final time, quiet and proud. In a chamber built to echo tradition, she left behind a new sound. Not thunder, not applause, but something far more lasting, the sound of power learning to listen. The headlines faded. The algorithms moved on. The court returned to its routine, robes, rulings, and reverence. But something in the country had shifted, not loudly, not instantly, but deeply. In a modest envelope with a Selma postmark, one letter arrived at Jasmine Crockett's office weeks after the hearings. The handwriting was uneven, the loops of the Y still uncertain, the way only a child writes when they haven't yet learned to doubt their own words. Inside was a crayon drawing. Jasmine at the podium, one hand holding the Constitution, the other clenched in quiet defiance. The courtroom behind her wasn't detailed, just lines and shadows. But Jasmine was drawn in full color. Red blazer, brown skin, a single speech bubble above her head that read, "This is for the ones who can't be here." The note underneath was short. It said, "My name is Alana. I'm 8. I live in Selma. I want to be brave like you, even when people don't clap." Jasmine sat with that letter for a long time, holding it like something sacred. Not because it was from a child, but because it proved what she had always believed. That courage wasn't about the courtroom. It was about who hears your voice when you walk out of it. The final scene fades not to applause or flashing lights, but to silence. Jasmine is seen leaving the court building alone. No cheering crowd, no press waiting at the base of the steps. Just the long shadow of the dome stretching behind her, and the sound of her heels echoing on stone. The same court that once tried to silence her had been left forever changed. And yet she asked for nothing. She doesn't look back. She just walks forward. Tall, certain, and unshakable. Because some voices don't fade. They resonate. They remind the powerful that they're being watched. They remind the silence that they are not alone. They remind the world that truth, once spoken, cannot be erased. The characters Jasmine Crockett and Neil Gorsuch portrayed in this story are entirely fictional and do not represent real people or actual events. Any resemblance to real individuals, living or deceased, is purely coincidental. This narrative is a creative work designed for storytelling and commentary purposes only, and it is fully protected under the principles of fair use. If this story moved you, challenged you, or made you think, please consider subscribing to my channel. Your support helps me continue to write and share powerful stories that amplify truth, courage, and the voices that too often go unheard. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for more.